On the 22nd of October, 1818, Seiler came to see her, and having remarked that she was lodging at the back of a public house, and that men were playing at ninepins under her window, said in the playful yet thoughtful manner which was peculiar to him, "See, see, all things are as they should be. The invalid nun, the spouse of our Lord, is lodging in a public house above the ground where men are playing at ninepins, like the soul of a man in his body." His interview with Anne Catherine was most affecting. It was indeed beautiful to behold these two souls, who were both on fire with the love of Jesus, and conducted by grace through such different paths, meet thus at the foot of the cross, the visible stamp of which was borne by one of them. On Friday, the 23rd of October, Seiler remained alone with her during nearly the whole of the day. He saw blood flow from her head, her hands, and her feet, and he was able to bestow upon her great consolation in her interior trials. He most earnestly recommended her to tell everything without reserve to the writer of these pages, and he came to an understanding upon the subject with her ordinary director. He heard her confession, gave her the Holy Communion on Saturday the 24th, and then continued his journey to the Count de Stolberg's. On his return, at the beginning of November, he again passed a day with her. He remained her friend until death, prayed constantly for her, and asked her prayers whenever he found himself in trying or difficult positions. The writer of these pages remained until January. He returned in May 1819, and continued to watch Anne Catherine almost uninterruptedly until her death. The saintly maiden continually besought the Almighty to remove the exterior stigmas, on account of the trouble and fatigue which they occasioned, and her prayer was granted at the end of 7 years. Towards the conclusion of the year 1819, the blood first flowed less frequently from her wounds, and then ceased altogether. On the 25th of December, scabs fell from her feet and hands, and there only remained white scars, which became red on certain days, but the pain she suffered was undiminished in the slightest degree. The mark of the cross and the wound on her right side were often to be seen as before, but not at any stated times. On certain days she always had the most painful sensations around her head, as though a crown of thorns were being pressed upon it. On these occasions she could not lean her head against anything, nor even rest it on her hand, but had to remain for long hours, sometimes even for whole nights, sitting up in her bed, supported by cushions, whilst her pallid face and the irrepressible groans of pain which escaped her made her like an awful living representation of suffering. After she had been in this state, blood invariably flowed more or less copiously from around her head. Sometimes her headdress only was soaked with it, but sometimes the blood would flow down her face and neck. On Good Friday, April 19th, 1819, all her wounds reopened and bled, and closed again on the following days. A most rigorous inquiry into her state was made by some doctors and naturalists. For that end she was placed alone in a strange house, where she remained from the 7th to the 29th of August. But this examination appears to have produced no particular effects in any way. She was brought back to her own dwelling on the 29th of August, and from that time until she died she was left in peace, save that she was occasionally annoyed by private disputes and public insults. On this subject, Overberg wrote her the following words: "What have you had to suffer personally of which you can complain? I am addressing a soul desirous of nothing so much as to become more and more like to her divine spouse. Have you not been treated far more gently than was your adorable spouse? Should it not be a subject of rejoicing to you, according to the Spirit, to have been assisted to resemble him more closely, and thus to be more pleasing in his eyes? You had suffered much with Jesus, but hitherto insults had been for the most part spared you. With the crown of thorns you had not worn the purple mantle and the robe of scorn, much less had you heard, "Away with him, crucify him, crucify him." I cannot doubt but these sentiments are yours. Praise be to Jesus Christ. On Good Friday, the 30th of March, 1820, blood flowed from her head, feet, hands, chest, and side. It happened that when she fainted, one of the persons who were with her, knowing that the application of relics relieved her, placed near her feet a piece of linen in which some were wrapped, and the blood which came from her wounds reached this piece of linen after a time. In the evening, when the same piece of linen with the relics was being placed on her chest and shoulders, in which she was suffering much, she suddenly exclaimed, while in a state of ecstasy, It is most wonderful, but I see my heavenly spouse lying in the tomb in the earthly Jerusalem, and I also see him living in the heavenly Jerusalem, surrounded by adoring saints. And in the midst of these saints I see a person who is not a saint, a nun. Blood flows from her head, her side, her hands, and her feet, and the saints are above the bleeding part. On the 9th of February, 1821, she fell into an ecstasy at the time of the funeral of a very holy priest. Blood flowed from her forehead, and the cross on her breast bled also. Someone asked her, "What is the matter with you?" She smiled and spoke like one awakening from a dream. "We were by the side of the body. I have been accused lately to hear sacred music, and the De Profundis made a great impression upon me." She died upon the same day 3 years later. In 1821, a few weeks before Easter, she told us that it had been said to her during her prayer, "Take notice, you will suffer on the real anniversary of the Passion, and not on the day marked this year on the ecclesiastical calendar." On Friday, the 30th of March, at 10 o'clock in the morning, she sank down senseless. Her face and bosom were bathed in blood, and her body appeared covered with bruises like what the blows of a whip would have inflicted. At 12 o'clock in the day, she stretched herself out in the form of a cross, and her arms were so extended as to be perfectly dislocated. A few minutes before 2 o'clock, drops of blood flowed from her feet and hands. On Good Friday, the 20th of April, she was simply in a state of quiet contemplation. This remarkable exception to the general rule seemed to be an effect of the providence of God, for at the hour when her wounds usually bled, a number of curious and ill-natured individuals came to see her with the intention of causing her fresh annoyances by publishing what they saw. But they thus were made unintentionally to contribute to her peace by saying that her wounds had ceased to bleed. On the 19th of February, 1822, she was again warned that she would suffer on the last Friday of March and not on Good Friday. On Friday the 15th, and again on Friday the 29th, the cross on her bosom and the wound on her side bled. Before the 29th, she more than once felt as though a stream of fire were flowing rapidly from her heart to her side, and down her arms and legs to the stigmas, which looked red and inflamed. On the evening of Thursday the 28th, she fell into a state of contemplation on the Passion, and remained in it until Friday evening. Her chest, head, and side bled. All the veins of her hands were swollen, and there was a painful spot in the center of them, which felt damp, although blood did not flow from it. No blood flowed from the stigmas excepting upon the 3rd of March, the day of the finding of the Holy Cross. She had also a vision of the discovery of the true cross by St. Helena, and imagined herself to be lying in the excavation near the cross. Much blood came in the morning from her head and side, and in the afternoon from her hands and feet, and it seemed to her as though she were being made the test of whether the cross was really the cross of Jesus Christ, and that her blood was testifying to its identity. In the year 1823, on Holy Thursday and Good Friday, which came on the 27th and 28th of March, she had visions of the Passion, during which blood flowed from all her wounds, causing her intense pain. Amid these awful sufferings, although ravished in spirit, she was obliged to speak and give answers concerning all her little household affairs, as if she had been perfectly strong and well, and she never let fall a complaint, although nearly dying. This time was the last time that her blood gave testimony to the reality of her union with the sufferings of Him who has delivered Himself up wholly and entirely for our salvation. Most of the phenomena of the ecstatic life which are shown us in the lives and writings of Saints Bridget, Gertrude, Mechtilde, Hildegard, Catherine of Siena, Catherine of Genoa, Catherine of Bologna, Colomba de Reti, Ledwina of Schiedam, Catherine Vanini, Teresa of Jesus, Anne of St. Bartholomew, Magdalene of Pazzi, Mary Viana, Mary Bonomi, Marina de Escobar, Crescentia de Cothburn, and many other nuns of contemplative orders are also to be found in the history of the interior life of Anne Catherine Emmerich. The same path was marked out for her by God. Did she, like these holy women, attain the end? God alone knows. Our part is only to pray that such may have been the case, and we are allowed to hope it. Those among our readers who are not acquainted with the ecstatic life from the writings of those who have lived it will find information on this subject in the introduction of Guris to the writing of Henry Suso, published at Ratisbon in 1829. Since many pious Christians, in order to render their life one perpetual act of adoration, endeavor to see in their daily employments a symbolical representation of some manner of honoring God, and offer it to Him in union with the merits of Christ, it cannot appear extraordinary that those holy souls who pass from an active life to one of suffering and contemplation should sometimes see their spiritual labors under the form of those earthly occupations which formerly filled their days. Then their acts were prayers. Now their prayers are acts. But the form remains the same. It was thus that Anne Catherine, in her ecstatic life, beheld this series of her prayers for the Church under the forms of parables, bearing reference to agriculture, gardening, weaving, sowing, or the care of sheep. All these different occupations were arranged, according to their signification, in the different periods of the common as well as the ecclesiastical year, and were pursued under the patronage and the assistance of the saints of each day, the special graces of the corresponding feasts of the Church being also applied to them. The signification of this circles of symbols had reference to all the active part of her interior life. One example will help to explain our meaning. When Anne Catherine, while yet a child, was employed in weeding, she besought God to root up the cockle from the field of the Church. If her hands were stung by the nettles, or if she was obliged to do afresh the work of idlers, she offered to God her pain and her fatigue, and besought Him, in the name of Jesus Christ, that the pastor of souls might not become weary, and that none of them might cease to labor zealously and diligently. Thus her manual labor became a prayer. I will now give a corresponding example of her life of contemplation and ecstasy. She had been ill several times, and in a state of almost continual ecstasy, during which she often moaned, and moved her hands like a person employed in weeding. She complained one morning that her hands and arms smarted and itched, and on examination they were found to be covered with blisters, like what would have been produced by the stinging of nettles. She then begged several persons of her acquaintance to join their prayers to hers for a certain intention. The next day her hands were inflamed and painful, as they would have been after hard work, and when asked the cause, she explained, I have so many nettles to root up in the vineyard, because those whose duty it was to do it only pulled off the stems, and I was obliged to draw the roots with much difficulty out of a stony soil. The person who had asked her the question began to blame these careless workmen, but he felt much confused when she replied, You were one of them. Those who only pull off the stems of the nettles and leave the roots in the earth are persons who pray carelessly. It was afterwards discovered that she had been praying for several dioceses, which were shown to her under the figure of vineyards laid waste, and in which labor was needed. The real inflammation of her hands bore testimony to this symbolical rooting up of the nettles, and we have perhaps reason to hope that the churches shown to her under the appearances of vineyards experienced the good effects of her prayer and spiritual labor, for since the door is open to those who knock, it must certainly be opened above all to those who knock with such energy as to cause their fingers to be wounded. Similar reactions of the spirit upon the body are often found in the lives of persons subject to ecstasies, and are by no means contrary to faith. St. Paula, if we may believe St. Jerome, visited the holy places in spirit just as if she had visited them bodily, and a like thing happened to St. Columba of Reti and St. Lidwina of Schiedam. The body of the latter bore tracks of this spiritual journey as if she had really traveled. She experienced all the fatigue that a painful journey would cause. Her feet were wounded and covered with marks which looked as if they had been